Gospel from Matthew chapter 5, Jesus explains that his disciples are blessings to a dark, decaying world. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. The Gospel of the Lord. God be with you. This morning we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, the Gospel reading, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and he very simply but reminds us this reminder that we certainly need, be what you are. In Europe during wartime, it was common for lighthouses to either dim their lights or shut them off completely. They didn't want to aid or assist any enemy ships to navigate those dangerous waters. And there's an unconfirmed story that comes to us from the late 1800s off the coast of Scotland, where there was a famous lighthouse with powerful beams that could stretch for miles, and it had saved countless ships from breaking up on the rocks on that rocky shoreline. But it was wartime, so they completely shut the lights off. And there was a Scottish ship that didn't get the news. They didn't know that the lighthouse had been turned off, and so they were searching and searching and searching and looking for the light, hoping to see it shining, and they kept going until they went into those dangerous waters and they ran aground. And a few of those soldiers, after the fact, they told an account of this story, and they said, well, we were looking for lights, but it was just never shining. A lighthouse that forgets its purpose ends up being more dangerous than if it just never existed at all. If those sailors hadn't been looking for the light, maybe they wouldn't have gotten so close to danger. You could say the same thing about a Christian. A Christian who forgets their purpose can be more dangerous to themselves and to the people around them than if they were never a Christian at all. Now that's a pretty bold statement, and we're going to see how Jesus addresses that in his preaching from Matthew chapter 5 today, but we're going to see that. How we need to remember to be what we are. Because if we forget that, or if we become something else and are disingenuous and show this light that's not really light or don't taste salty in the world, we can be more dangerous to our own faith than an unbeliever. We can be more dangerous to the people around us than somebody who was never salt or never light in the first place. Jesus is addressing these types of things in this section of his Sermon on the Mount. And he very simply, at the very beginning, he just reminds us, he says, let's start here and let's remember your identity. He put it this way: you are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Very famous and well-known passages or teachings from Jesus, and he simply just states it. He says, this is what you are. It's worth it to pause here and just understand to see exactly what Jesus is saying. He's not saying maybe someday you can become salt if you live good enough, if you try hard enough, if you believe enough. Maybe you can shine like the light and you can kind of be like a dimmer switch that starts off at a really low level and then kind of gets bigger and bigger and brighter and brighter. He says this just is what you are. This is your identity as a Christian. Salt and light are very useful things today, but in the ancient world, they were very useful then too. You can use salt like back in Jesus' time. You could use salt in the same way we do to make your food taste a little nicer. But you could also use salt to preserve food when you didn't have a refrigerator. You could use salt to stop decay in a dying body, in a dead body. Roman soldiers sometimes were paid in salt. It was so valuable. In fact, that's where we get our word salary from. You can kind of see that salt, salary, to be paid in salt. Salt was very useful. It had a purpose. And light in very much the same way. Very useful. It has a purpose. If the lights are on, you can keep working. Once the lights go off, you can't see what you're doing anymore, and it's time to go to bed. Salt and light, very useful and have a purpose. And that's really what Jesus is getting at. He's saying, you as his disciples, you are useful to the world. You have a purpose. So be useful and be purposeful, is his point. He says, this is your identity, and now go put it into action. And that's where he goes next. He says, a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. If you're traveling and you're looking for a town and you see it up ahead and you see that it's built on a hill and you can see its buildings and the light that's shining from it, you know exactly where you're going. It'd be so silly to light a lamp and then immediately extinguish it, to say, well, I just turned it on for a moment, but I'm not going to use it for its actual purpose. Jesus is getting at, he says, you are salt, you are light, you are purposeful and useful, now go and be that. But notice how he says, first there is the identity. This is who you are. This is what I've made you. Now there's action. Go and use it. And we've got to remember that order of operations, that God gives us our identity, and then he says, now go and be that. Because Jesus includes a warning. He says, well, what happens if salt loses its saltiness? It's not good for anything. This one's a little bit hard for us to wrap our brains around because I don't think you've ever went to the store and got a little thing of salt. You spend like 75 cents on a whole bunch of salt. It's so cheap these days. And you've tasted it and you say, oh, this isn't salty at all. The quality control over at Morton is pretty good. All the salt that we get is very salty. Not so in the ancient world. You could get some salt and it'd come to you and it would look just like salt. You taste it and you say, oh, this is more dirt than salt. The quality control, wherever I got this, it's no good. And you just throw it out right where it came from. You throw it right back into the path. Salt that doesn't have its saltiness is good for absolutely nothing. Jesus is saying the same thing about a Christian. If you've become a Christian and God has made you his disciple, but then you aren't living like a Christian, you've forgotten what you are, then it would have been better if you had never existed in the first place. He even goes further than just saying it's no longer good for anything. He says it should be trampled underfoot. Strong words from Jesus about his disciples. But Jesus reminds us, he says, well, there's a reason he has to give such a strong warning, because he has to tell us how dangerous it is if a Christian forgets what they are. First, he tells us how dangerous it can be for ourselves. At the end of the reading, he put it this way. He said, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. For the people that Jesus was teaching as they were hearing this would have been such a shocking statement for them. Because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, if there was anybody who had righteousness, at least as perceived by the people of Jesus' day, it would have been them. It would have been the Pharisees who had so many extra rules and laws, and they made sure everybody saw that they followed them to a T. If there was ever anybody who you'd say they have righteousness and they have it to the full, you'd say it was the teachers of the law. They're the ones where they haven't forgotten to dot any I's or cross any T's. It at least looked from an outward perspective that they were the ones who had righteousness. And Jesus says, I tell you the truth, unless it's more than that, unless it's greater than that, unless you can be perfect, then you're not going to be in the kingdom of heaven. And what Jesus was getting at was, he was reminding them, he was saying, you can't try to be somebody that you're going to create. You can't have this manufactured, human-made righteousness like the Pharisees wanted to, as they looked at all of the teachings in the Old Testament and they said, we have to follow every single one of them. Jesus said, even if you try to do that, you can't earn righteousness on your own. He said, instead, just go back to the beginning. Remember that you already are salt. You already are light. Remember what God has made you. Because the only way to have that perfect righteousness is to receive it from our Savior Jesus. There's a few things I said at the beginning. I said kind of, at least to me, a shocking statement that a Christian who forgets what they are can be more dangerous to themselves than if they were never a Christian in the first place. And so here's where I get to defend that a little bit. What could happen if you tried to get righteousness for yourself? If you forgot who you were and you said, it's time for me to go out and to do all the rules and to follow all the laws, and then to go to God and place it in front of Him and say, look, here's my body of work. This is the righteousness that I've made for you. Look, I'm ground cinnamon or something. I'm not salt. Look, I'm sugar, and that's a whole lot better. I'm not salt. Then you have something to boast in. You have something to say, look at what I am and who I am. Better than the people over there, and good enough to get into heaven. And you might say, yeah, I don't think I really do this very often, but so often it happens where we play that comparison game. As you see something on the news and the things that people have done, you see something on the news and the way that people think, and it's so different than any way that you would live your life, and it's so different than any way you would think. You think, how can people be so dumb and so angry and so violent? How can people be so unloving? And you don't say it out loud or think it out loud, but what you're really thinking and saying is, I would never do that. I've got something that they don't. Pride. In the human heart, it runs deep. The other thing that can happen in trying to run this race of righteousness and trying to create it for ourselves could be on the completely other side. I don't want to offend anybody who runs on a treadmill as their exercise. Sometimes when I actually do some exercise, that's what I do. So if I'm offending you, I'm offending me. But when you run on a treadmill, you get done, and really the only thing that you've gotten is you've got a whole lot more tired. You come off and you're in the exact same spot as when you started. Maybe there's a mile or 2 or 3 or 10 that says that you've run, but you're in the exact same spot and you're just, now you're tired. When it comes to trying to earn righteousness for ourselves, it's like running that spiritual treadmill. You get on it and you say, all right, I'm going to be better today and do more today and run harder and gain that righteousness for myself. And you get off and you're not any closer to God, but you're a whole lot more burnt out. You can fall into this pit of despair if you try to earn righteousness for yourself, because you and I can never have righteousness that surpasses the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They tried their hardest. They were sprinting at like speed 12 at an 8 incline, and they did it, and they got off, and they were in the exact same spot as when they started, not any closer to God. The third way that this can be really dangerous is really a culmination of what happens in both of those, to fall into that, to climb the mountain of pride or to fall into the pit of despair. They both do the same things, and the Apostle Paul talked about it. He put it this way. He said, those of you who are trying to be justified by the law have alienated yourselves from Christ. So to try to justify yourself by the law, that would be trying to earn God's righteousness by following the law, the 10 Commandments, and more than those, all the commands. And he says, if you try to do that, you actually alienate yourself from Christ. You separate yourself from Him. You know how that happens, right? If you're trying to justify yourself by the law, then you're trying to take Christ's place. That's what He did. You're saying, I think I can do that. Christ, I don't think I need you. Yeah, if we forget who we are, that God just says, you are salt, you are light, you have His righteousness that is surpassing that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. If we forget all of that, it can be so dangerous to ourselves, because we can trick ourselves and completely squash out faith in Jesus as the one who saves. Jesus doesn't just say that it's dangerous to ourselves, though. He says it can be dangerous to the people around us. He put it this way. He said, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. You might look at this and you say, okay, well, Pastor, that one's good for you. You should put that on a sticky note and put it on your mirror and read it in the morning because you're the one teaching, right? You're the pastor. But I don't know about me. You might look at that and say, I'm not the one who does a whole lot of teaching. And Pastor, that's good for you, but what about for me? Well, the way that we live our lives and the things that we say, we teach God's commands each and every day. And probably the number one way that you and I, pastor, teacher, staff minister, or layperson, that you and I fall into line with this is when we live our lives in a way that doesn't match up with salt and light. As Christians, we think, okay, being a Christian means I should be nice, and I should be moral, and I should be non-confrontational. But being a Christian doesn't mean that you should be non-confrontational. There's so many times when you and I have to confront with the things that we do. You're with a group of people, and they're doing something that doesn't match up with what it means to be salt and light, and you might have to be confrontational and walk away. You're among a group of people, and you see sin. You might have to do something that is confrontational and say something. Salt and light, you can't deny that it's there. If something is salty, you taste it. If you turn the light on, it cuts through the darkness. And a Christian doesn't stay quiet. A Christian doesn't fade into the background. A Christian does and speaks when they need to. So you look at all that and you say, it seems like here, Pastor, you are speaking out of both sides of your mouth a little bit. You're saying that God tells us, I am salt, I am light, it's just something that I am, and now it looks like there's all this stuff that I got to do. I've got to try to be that in my life. I've got to try to just lean on Jesus for all that righteousness, and I've got to speak when I got to speak, and I've got to do when I've got to do. It's all getting kind of muddled and mixed up. Take a step back. What Jesus is having us do is just to recognize that we don't just need to be what God has made us, but also confess what we are. And that is sinful. It's at this point where you and I not going back and trying to try harder or be better or run on that spiritual treadmill, but just to drop down on knees and to say to God, I'm sorry. There are times when I've forgotten to be that salt, when I haven't been that light. Dear Lord, just forgive me. And then what Jesus is inviting us to do is not just to stay there on our knees, but to listen to who Jesus is, to listen what Jesus has done, to see who he is, and remember that he remembered what he was meant to be. And Jesus talks about that too. Don't think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. What Jesus was saying here is, he's reminding us of those Pharisees and teachers of the law who tried to fulfill everything in God's commands, and we know just as well as they did that they failed at that. But then Jesus is pointing at himself, and he's saying, every little last thing that needed to be fulfilled in the Old Testament, every I that needed to be dotted and every T that needed to be crossed, Jesus is saying that was going to be fulfilled in him. In Tuesday and Wednesday, we've been gathering we just gathered one time, but we will gather a few more times to study the Gospel of Matthew. And so what we've been learning a few things about the Gospels, and one of the things we learned about the Gospel of Matthew last week is that Matthew uses one phrase more than any of the other gospel writers. He uses it about 14 times, depending on how you count it. And it's this phrase. He writes, "These things happened to fulfill what was written in the prophets." As you read through the Gospel of Matthew, it just keeps coming back. And sometimes they're small things, seemingly small things. Born in Bethlehem, these things happened to fulfill the prophets. From Nazareth, so he'd be called a Nazarene. This happened so he'd fulfill the prophets. He went to Zebulun and Naphtali. This happened to fulfill the prophets. And you say, okay, there's Jesus crossing the T and dotting the I, getting done what needs to get done. You know the number one way that Jesus fulfilled the law and prophets? The biggest thing where these happened to fulfill what was written there? It's like the underline, the large print, the bold. Jesus died to fulfill the law's demands. This is the number one thing that Jesus did to fulfill all of that. When Jesus died, it's like the Bible is putting this underline, bold, capital letters that said Jesus died to fulfill the law's demands, because the law's demands are that none of us should enter into heaven. The law's demands is that only Jesus could be the one to go, because he was the one who did it perfectly from the very beginning. But he did that for you and me. As you and I fall on our knees and we confess to God that we haven't been salt and we haven't been light, all we need to do is to look at our Savior Jesus, who fulfilled every single seemingly small command by dotting the I and crossing the T, and fulfilling the greatest command of all, to die in our place, to satisfy the law's demands. Jesus, in this reading, includes encouragement for our lives too. He also included this. He said, "So, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." This is the next step. It's what happens after we repent and after we see who Jesus is and what he's done for us. It's just a thing that flows out of us. In the second and third centuries AD, there were some plagues that were running through Rome. And historians tell us that as many people were fleeing that area, they were getting out, they were saving themselves, Christians stuck around. They stayed around to help out. They subjected themselves to that danger and that disease. And they didn't do it to point the spotlight on themselves, but they did it because they knew it was the right thing to do, to stay and to help. And historians also tell us that during that time, many people came to the faith. They were converted to Christianity, not because they were argued into it, but because they saw what the Christians were doing. They said, there must be something here. They became a Christian through the Word, and they glorified God in heaven. This is what Jesus is getting at here. You, as the salt and light of the earth, you have an opportunity to act differently, to speak differently, to be different in a world full of people that are persuaded by the devil, to be the salt of the earth, to be the light of the world, to confess your sin to God and to be motivated by him to live completely differently. Simply be what you are. Amen.